postpone if you have something else, Rabbi.
No, because people watch on YouTube.
Okay.
Oh.
Welcome, everybody, as today we are celebrating July and coming together. Most places just stop everything in July and don't do anything. We are not most places. We continue our study sessions. We're recording online. Welcome to people watching on YouTube. I know a couple of people are not able to make it and they want the link. Welcome to Mac or Mackenzie, who is here for the first time. So thrilled to have you. He's here, although he's living in the Savannah area. He is in, actually, sorry, I gotta turn off this. He's actually in Vegas right now. So enjoy your time there. So Larry, Jane, and Mackenzie, and everybody else online, I hope you guys enjoy the talk today. We're going to talk a little bit about European cities. And we had just talked previously about talking about some of the history of Jews and countries and cities. And so it's kind of nice that we have had Jews in so many places, but as we go through a couple of the European countries, and we can do more later, we'll see that they've had some rocky times and some good times. Luckily, more good times now than rocky, but we all know that situations can change. So we're going to talk about just a couple of countries in Europe. Probably haven't heard of them, but the first one we're going to do is a country called France, which is in Europe. So we did England last week, but we also talked a lot about Israel last week as we see what's going on there continuously. But the French history is very interesting because of many reasons, but one, because most people don't realize it's one of the largest Jewish communities in the world. So it has been for some time, even though it's shrinking a little bit because of the, French Jews moving to Israel. It's still, I think, number 3 right now after Israel and America. Now it's a distant 3, Israel and America. America is probably 5.5 million, and Israel is like 7 million or 6.5, 7 million, and France is 500,000. So you can tell the drop off from 1 and 2 to 3. But it is the 3rd largest population in the world Jewishly. It's hard to tell sometimes in Russia. And of course, it's about twice as large as the 2nd Jewish population in Europe, which is England. So there's a big drop off from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, and 3 to 4. So in England, I think there's, as we talked last time, it's about 250,000. So still significant, but there's really not a large Jewish population anywhere outside of Israel and America. So let's go through a little bit of the history of France, and we have talked a little bit about it when we talked about the Dreyfus Affair, which we'll touch on as well. But obviously, we hear a lot about the Jews of France because of the anti-Semitism that's been on the rise, and that is true, but we also have to remember that there's 500,000 Jews there must have been good times as well. So let's go through a little bit of the history, which I think many of you know. We can't always prove who the first Jews were in these European places, but often probably Jews who were part of the Roman Empire. They were in the military, they were traders for the Roman Empire, and they end up there. But really, there's not that many documented Jews that are in France very early on. There's some references to prohibitions against Jews, and the 4th century and the 5th century, there's references to a few funerals and to some mingling, but there's really that we know of strong history of a Jewish community there before maybe the 7th century CE. So again, there were Jews there. We know that when Theodosian had his code created in 331, when Constantine created the Christian world and the Muslim world, there were Jews there. There were rabbis, some distant priests. We already know that they were working in the merchant world, but really by the 6th century, there were Jews in a variety of places that will become France of today. Of course, Paris, Orleans, Bordeaux. And so by the 7th century, there were Jews in these areas. We know they were there obviously earlier, but we don't have as many references to them. But we do know that there was some good relations between Jews and Christians in the 4th and 5th century. And then in the 6th century, we have some of our first anti-Semitic moments in terms of the Jews being thought that they should be exposed, councils warning against them. But generally speaking, a lot of the anti-Semitism we think of in Europe, remember, doesn't occur until the last millennium. So there were periods where Jews were living very difficult lives, but there are also periods where they were doing really well. And so in southern France and northern France especially, which of today, a lot of times Jews did extremely well through the 7th, 8th, 9th century. There's even rumors and references of Jewish merchants rebelling against some of the kings who weren't treating them well. Obviously, we get to the time of Charlemagne where we find a lot more documentation. And we see that in some cases, Jews were doing very well as traders because they're always doing well as traders. And also Charlemagne didn't want to trade very often with the East. And so sometimes the Jews were the only traders to the East for Charlemagne. So he was often very generous to Jews comparatively. He had special dispensation for Jews to even sue Christians, which was not always allowed. But there were also restrictions. They couldn't trade in certain things. And as in many of the cases, the Jews were the property of in this case, the emperor, or in other places, the kings. So Charlemagne and his son also both respected the Jews as merchants and so dealt with them fairly well. And as time went on, the Jews in this area, did very well for several hundred years. There was, of course, moments where people were very jealous of them, where the descendants of Charlemagne were not thrilled with them. But, the Jews were the main trading partner to the Middle East. There's even a rumor that one of the descendants of Charlemagne married a Jewish woman because she wouldn't take an oath on Christianity. And there's also rumors that the Jewish traders from this area of the world, France, were on very good terms with various popes. They were also on very good terms with various caliphates in the East. In Babylon, where Jews, of course, were doing very well at this time. So from the first period we hear of Jews in France to the year 1000, that's a good year to use, they're doing pretty well. Again, there's restrictions, obviously, because they're different. But they were generally controlled or under the auspices of a king or an emperor. And they were very connected to the Pope in many periods, especially as traders. And so they did very well probably compared to any other people who were not Christians. But even comparatively to the Christians, a lot of the Christians were very poor. So they were doing probably pretty well and had a thriving community in various cities throughout France. So 1000 is a good year to really start the change. And remember, a lot of people think it was the Reformation that created the persecution, but really it's the year 1000, and in France is one of the central places where these anti-Jewish sentiments began, France and England, at similar times. It's usually the 11th century. That's where it happens. In France, it's a little earlier than England, but it's the 11th century. In France, you have a king named Robert who is, it's a great name, but this particular Robert was very anti-Jewish, even was called the Pious. And so he, basically started to kill Jews, force them to convert, instigate or not stop mob violence. He was not concerned with burning people at the stake. So he's kind of the first king or leader starting 1000-ish where Jews started to really suffer. In fact, during his reign, there was a Jew who bribed the Pope to get him to stop killing Jews, and it actually worked. So the Pope actually was able to stop him. But as we know, in the 11th century, as in other places, we see the blood libel. We see the Jews being blamed when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is destroyed by the Muslims. We see, of course, the first of the Crusades, which really sets things off even more so. So there are various, again, moments where various things happen over and over then. Jews being massacred. So again, when we think of the 11th century, it is not a good time, although at certain periods and places it was probably fine. We look at it as a whole, as a time where all of these terrible things are happening. But there are also good moments in time. Several of the popes in the 11th century were very supportive and even came to the defense, even came and forced kings and people to stop forcibly converting them. But the irony, of course, is we're going to have the first crusade in the 11th century at the end. And this is a time when Jews are just doing really well in the north and south of France. So the 11th century is a terrible century, yet we know Jews are doing really well in the north and south. And the 12th century in France is going to be one of the greatest centuries for Jews in that area of the world. So it's kind of a dichotomy of a little bit of everything. Any questions so far? You guys probably know a little bit about the history, but we'll go through a little bit with what happens during the Crusades. So the Crusades start with the idea of going to obviously Jerusalem, taking it back, but of course, during the several Crusades, they kill Jews and others, of course, throughout Europe, because most of the Crusaders never make it to Europe. Most of the Crusaders are second, third, fourth, fifth born who do not have property, and so they're really more concerned with making money. But we know about all these stories. What is the really incredible story is the 12th century of France, because the 12th century in France and the end of the 11th century is really where we get some of the great scholarship. And one of the greatest scholars of all time, we're talking top 3, if not number 1, is of course Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, and he lived in the 11th century. Died in 1105, but is probably the greatest commentator in Jewish history. There is not a Talmud that has been typed or written since this guy died that does not have his comments in it. I mean, his commentary on the Bible, especially the Torah, is legendary. He basically simplified everything and made it very understandable for everybody. He was a master of Midrash, as so were others. His grandsons were renowned, especially his grandson, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, who became Rashbam. His students became legendary. And so during this 11th and 12th century, where all these terrible things are going on in the north and south of France, you have this incredible scholarship that to this day is considered some of the best of all time. And so that's the irony of France, but it's also something we have to talk about because we talk about a lot of the hatred against Jews and all these anti-Semitic acts, but they're not happening necessarily every single day. But if you look at the whole, it can look very depressing. But in the moment, people may have been doing very well because it just depends where you were living. So I'm not going to talk as much about the Crusades anymore because we talked about so much. We know about the blood libel. That was something, very, very prominent. So what happens eventually? Jews are kicked out of France. They're welcomed back. Why are they kicked out? Well, various reasons. Sometimes the coffers are low. This happens several times, and so they kick out the Jews and take their property, only to realize that, it's kind of like Africa. You have all of these hunting trips in Kenya or South Africa, and can you make more money from the hunting trips or the photography trips? Obviously, the photography ones, because the animals will all be dead. And so they take all of the Jewish wealth in this one moment, but then all of a sudden the Jews aren't making money for them anymore. And so they bring them back under very harsh circumstances, let them do their thing and help the economy. And then when one king or ruler is not very financially savvy, he kicks them out because they need a lot of money in the moment. And this happens several times in the 12th century and 13th century before the Jews are eventually kicked out. Now, you are going to have some kings or rulers that are better than others. Louis VIII of France apparently was a very good one. But again, it's always dependent on the ruler because the Jews are generally considered property or representatives of the ruler. So if you have a good ruler who understands how to treat them well, tax them, but let them do their thing, then things went well. But then when you have rulers who are not capable, or if you have a terrible situation like a blight or plague, then Jews are going to suffer. So, and France was no different. So now in some cases Louis IX, who was a little strange, but anyway, burned as many manuscripts of the Talmud and Jewish works as he could and became harsher and harsher on them. But then at times he was very good to them. But then, of course, he went on a crusade, got captured, so all bets were off. So he's in captivity. Obviously, others are ruling. And so one of the rulers, his son-in-law, decides to arrest Jews and seize their properties, and then places the rule about wearing badges. So this is in the 13th century. They bring in the Inquisition in the 13th century. And by 1306, basically the treasury is empty, and they banish Jews and take as much of their money as they can. But then they welcome the Jews back in 1315 because obviously they need money again. So what was going on in the 13th century continues in the 14th century. Wearing the badge, there's a lot of restrictions, but by the end of the 14th century, out of nowhere, Charles VI, as many of you know, kicks the Jews out. It's about 100 years after Jews have been kicked out of England. And Jews are basically kicked out, not as quickly. They get some time to sell stuff, which was at least nice. They were, in some cases, Christians were required to pay out their debts to the Jews, which was really different. Now, we also have to remember there were Jews in Provence at this period in 1394, but 1394 is not the year Provence becomes part of France. So although Jews are kicked out of France, they're going to still be Jews in what is today's France. And also there's going to obviously be Jews who are conversos, who are pretending to be Christian, but are staying Jewish. So When Jews are kicked out in 1394, they are still in Provence. And then at the end of the 15th century, Provence becomes part of France, and then Jews are kicked out at the end of the 15th century, early 16th century. So there are no Jews in England around 1290. There are no Jews in France around 1394, and then by 1500 the Jews have been kicked out of Provence, which is now part of France. So when did Jews come back? Roughly the same time as they do in England, although a little bit earlier. So in the 17th century, Jews are starting to be given the opportunity to come back. There's no laws, but eventually various kings, especially Louis XIV, allows them to come back, although they had already realized. So Jews had already kind of been coming back a little bit in the early 17th century. But by 1675, it's official that Jews are now allowed back in France. So really, England officially allows them a little earlier, but by the 17th century, Jews are back in France as they were in England. And so who are these Jews now who are back there? You have both Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews coming to this area of the world. Obviously, the Sephardic Jews are often more knowledgeable, wealthier, because they've been living in places like Amsterdam and the Muslim world. So by 100 years later, there are both Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazic Jews in France. There's about 50,000 when the revolution happens. And the revolution in France is one of the most important moments in Jewish history all time, because the revolution in France is the determining factor for what happens to Jews in Europe to this day, not counting the Holocaust. The revolution creates freedoms for Jews that had before this time been unheard of. So what happens, first of all, before Napoleon takes over France in 1789, of course, they give full citizenship to Jews, which is especially Sephardic Jews, because obviously they're trying to give freedoms to everyone. So once the fall of Bastille, and you have Jewish rights being supported. In fact, they debated it several times in these meetings. And in 1790, officially all Portuguese Jews and Sephardic Jews basically are given full rights. It's going to take a little bit of time for Ashkenazic Jews. But again, these were non-Jews in these assemblies supporting Jewish rights, because they were trying to give rights to everybody. And the Jewish rights were just kind of given, although, officially it would take a year or two. But by the end of the 1791, Jews have full rights. And it's really a first time that Jews are given this rights out in Europe, outside of course, America, although, as we'll see, they were doing very well in Amsterdam. There are going to be, of course, moments where things go bad, but there's going to be what they call the Reign of Terror, which happens during this period where this influx of new ideas is coming and not everybody agrees to them. But as long as Jews give proof of their patriotism officially, they are going to be given full rights. So this is going to be even further promoted with Napoleon. So Napoleon is one of the most significant figures in Jewish history, even though he obviously wasn't Jewish, that we know, but he could have been. So Napoleon, of course, comes into power and is very supportive of Jewish rights. Now, does he like Jews? Nobody knows if he actually liked Jews. He did take back some of these rights a little bit later, but he basically liberated Jews all across Europe from the ghettos. He created what he called a Grand Sanhedrin. He asked Jews to answer questions to show their support for being part of French, being part of, being French citizens, which they did. And basically, Jews ran out of the ghettos to join this movement. There would be repression as it went back and forth, but really, it's Napoleon who really turned over the largest stone. So after he died, obviously, there were calls to stop this emancipation of the French Jews, but it had already taken hold so much that they never did. There were obviously issues and times that Jews weren't treated fairly, but legally they were full citizens in France. And not only that, by 1831, all restrictions or the idea that Jews were inferior legally were taken away. And so by 1831, not only are they full citizens, but they have full rights as anybody else. And although the vote was very close, it wasn't that close. I mean, generally speaking, the country was in favor of it. Now, obviously, we're going to talk a little about the issues that come later. That even, well, again, it took a few years before they were able to go into court and really, say, I swear on the Jewish Bible. But generally speaking, in 1870, there were also French Jews in Algeria who were given full citizenship along with all the other Muslims or people in Algeria. So not only Jews in France, but Jews living in some of the places that France controlled also were given full rights. Now, we all know that that is going to be very controversial for some people because towards the second half of the 19th century, anti-Semitism in France is going to grow. There's going to be a whole anti-Semitic movement with newspapers, but there's also going to be a lot of people very supportive of the Jewish world. So it's going to be a little bit of both, and it all comes to head in one of the seminal moments in French history, which of course is the Dreyfus Affair, which we've talked about. The Dreyfus Affair was such a difficult time in France that the country was divided into two groups. And remember, Dreyfus is a Jewish guy. You were either pro-Dreyfus or anti-Dreyfus. That's how their political parties were divided. That is really strange. Think about this. Think like in America, the Republican Party would be, pro something, and the Democratic would be pro, and it's all based upon Jews in this case. So that's how widespread the ramifications. You were a Dreyfusard or you an anti-Dreyfusard, and that's how the country was divided for 15 years. And it's really a sad story for Dreyfus, but it really is, in the end, it turns out all right. So who was Dreyfus? Remember, he was a captain in the military. He was convicted in 1894 of passing secrets to the German embassy, and he was sent to a penal colony for 5 years. He was there for 5 years. Evidence came to light that it was not him, because the stuff was still going. The information was still being passed. The French army knew who it was, and they decided to suppress it and accuse Dreyfus of additional charges. So not only did they suppress it, they added charges to Dreyfus's sentence. However, one person sent some of this evidence to Emile Zola, who of course we all know was a newspaper guy and an activist, and it got out that Dreyfus had been set up. And so this is what divided the society. Some believed that Dreyfus was guilty, others believed he was innocent. They had a new trial in which it was proven that he was innocent, except the evidence showed he was innocent, but they gave him 10 more years. So he was actually convicted a second time during this new trial when it became very obvious he was guilty. But after the trial, he was pardoned and set free. And in 1906, he went back and became reinstated. So he actually went back to the army, a full 10 years after he was, went to, was 12 years after he went to prison. He was actually reinstated as a major 12 years later. Just think about that, and ended up serving for a long time. So basically, eventually, the Dreyfusards won, but it caused this ruckus and allowed radicals to come to power at some point. But Jews started doing even better in the 20th century in France.
Rabbi, can I ask a question
Sure.
about Dreyfus? What in the years preceding Dreyfus, what was it that divided the country against Judaism then? There must have been events that took place that established the precedent. Dreyfus didn't just happen overnight,
Right.
spark. But what was it that was creating the anti-Semitism in France?
Well, you got to understand, anti-Semitism is they're going to concoct whatever they want. So that's the first thing. One, of course, with the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds were one of the richest families in France. So obviously that would be one. Racism was another, because we had a lot of the ideas that race was genetic and that Jews were inferior. There was also class conflict. There were also individuals who just hated Jews. So I can't pronounce the name of the main guy because I had never learned how to pronounce it. Alphonse Toussaint or Toussaint is the most famous one, who was basically a writer and a newspaper guy who was really talking about that the race of Jews is different, something that we would see the Nazis use later on. And he would compare animals to Jews and how some animals are better and that kind of stuff. So he was one of those guys. Also, Edward Drummond, who founded the Anti-Semitic League of France, was the editor of La Libre Parole, which is the famous newspaper that was calling Jews Christ killers. So, you've got the killing Christ, you've got they're rich, you've got racism. So it's a little bit of everything.
Was there an economic problem in France at the time also? Like, of course, Hitler, when you look back at Hitler and how he was able to come to power, part of it was, after World War I and the Depression and worldwide depression and blaming the Jews as the scapegoats. And was it similar in France?
No, there was economic problems at certain points, I think in the 1880s and early 90s. But remember, this stuff starts in the 1840s. So there's not an economic downturn for 60 years. So there are periods where this makes it even worse, but it is not the same as that. This is a longer period where Jews are being blamed for a wide variety of things by different people at different times. You've got socialists who believe that Jews shouldn't be involved in this. You've got people who think that the Jews should be a lower class. You've got people who think they're different beings. You have people who don't like them because they think they're all rich. And a lot of it, the similar stuff we have today, except for the racism, which isn't as prominent in the Jewish world today.
You mentioned socialism. Was communism part of the problem there also? This was around the same time as communism was taking hold.
Communism was not probably as big of an issue. There were a lot of Jewish communists, and there were a lot of Jews who were communistic. A lot of it had to do more with separation as opposed to, so I don't think communism was, I'm sure there were some, some of these guys were communists and socialists. So that, I mean, it's all, everything was an issue. I mean, to say one thing wasn't, but again, when you find these people are anti-Semitic, they're going to figure, I mean, all, you know, all of a sudden you get to bring in the Christ killer one, which hadn't been around, you know, hadn't been used in a while. And so always the money is always going to be it, because you can always find one rich Jewish person and then blame all the Jews for being rich. I mean, so.
Was there the same reaction against Muslims at the time?
I don't know if there was the same. There will be more later, but I don't know if it was as, I think there was obviously some as well, but there's something about Jews who were doing very well. The Muslims were not doing as well socially or financially, and the Muslims always had trouble integrating, whereas the Jews had completely assimilated, which is one of the issues that, Jews look like everybody else. They were taking jobs of everybody else. So obviously there's always prejudice against Muslims. They were considered inferior, but they were not becoming part of the society in the ways Jews are. Even today, a lot of the Muslims have difficulty assimilating in that world. In America, they're assimilating very easily, but in that world, it was, at that time, it was very difficult.
Could you go back to Rashi just for a minute?
Sure.
Can you give us about a 2-minute kind of explanation of why he is such a great scholar? What was his thinking? What was the things that he said that illuminated Judaism or clarified it? Was the simplicity? Was it his commentaries on everything?
Well, obviously, it was first of all, the amazing amount. I mean, he lived to 65. The amazing amounts. That's one. Two, it was the way he brought tradition kind of back, and that he showed that really he was what you would call kind of a piety proponent, that Judaism should be a religion of being a good human being. He was also not what you would call a mystic. He was very straightforward in trying to take sometimes very difficult subject matter and clarifying it to people who may not have understood it beforehand. So, making very short comments about things, sometimes longer ones, to make sure people could find the meaning and understanding. And so he really brought, in many cases, the Talmud and the Bible to the people. Because if you're reading the Talmud and you understand it, you could go to Rashi and very quickly get a little clarification, which was really helpful. He also made it very popular to study the Talmud and the Bible as well. So that was, he was also one of the people who made it really popular again in this part of the world. Because remember, the scholarship in the Jewish world was not in Europe. It was in Babylon. It was in the Caliphate at this time. And then Spain as well. Spain became a central place for Jewish non-religious scholarship. And so he kind of brought this religious scholarship to Europe in a way that had not been done before. So it was that's what he did. And to this day, I mean, it's 1,000 years later, and nobody has, some people might say Maimonides was, more brilliant, and certainly theologically, he was not only a Talmudist, but a philosopher. But, Maimonides was very controversial in his day. In some cases still is, whereas Rashi was more of the bringer to the people, and still is. I mean, nobody doubts that Rashi is the number one Talmudic and biblical commentator. It's not even a debate. You can debate number two, but you can't debate number one. And he's basically in every single Talmud, every one. So, and his grandson is part of a group that's in most of them as well. So his students became very prominent as well. And again, any other questions? So we'll go back to the Dreyfus Affair. Eventually, obviously, it's, it helps create the country of Israel, but we're in France. So in the beginning of the 20th century, but you also have to remember when we talk about France, France is the intellectual capital of Europe at this point. So during all this anti-Semitic time periods, it's also the time where all of the people we think about in the 1880s and 1890s that made the intellectual center of Europe, it's in Paris. And so you've got Marx there. You later are going to have all of these great thinkers from every discipline there. So, and some of them are Jewish. Marx is Jewish. Chagall is Jewish. He's going to be living there. Who are some of the other ones? Freud. There's a great many of them. Plus you got the Rothschilds. So Jews are going to become very affluent in many respects in France in the 20th century. At one point, it's believed that 1/3 of all Paris bankers were Jewish. Think about that. Obviously, the Rothschilds. Eventually, you have World War I, and anti-Semitism goes to an all-time low in France after World War I. It had already been curtailed, but after World War I, people saw that Jews served in the military and died. And if you're going to serve in the military and die in the military, then people are going to be more supportive. So what creates the anti-Semitism we know of in France after World War I? Well, a lot of it is the immigration of Eastern European Jews. Just like America, a lot of Eastern European Jews had started moving there in the 1880s and continue, and then after World War I. And so you have about 200,000 Eastern European Jews moving there, which is overwhelming the smaller Jewish group that has been assimilated. So you have these assimilated Jews, kind of like America, but even more so. And then you have all of these immigrants coming, and these new immigrants, as opposed to America and France, didn't try and assimilate or didn't assimilate as well. So they started Yiddish newspapers and they kept speaking Yiddish. And they were Zionists and they were communists. And so the anti-Semitism started to rise, especially, obviously, after the crash of 1929. So by the 1930s, you have mainstream people who are now vehemently anti-Semitic and denouncing the Jews and supporting the Nazis before they come into the country. So when the Nazis take over, we all know what happens. The Vichy government is very supportive to the Nazi and hands over Jews, and a high percent of the Jews are dying. We're not going to go through the Holocaust there. I think we all know. But after the war, obviously France has apologized many times. After the war, there were about 180,000 Jews still in Europe. So, France. So, hundreds of thousands had died. And then in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, you started having more Jews move to France. But who are these Jews who are moving to France? They're the Jews that were living in the Muslim world. So the influx of Jews into France, especially in the 50s, were from the Muslim world. Why? Because of the creation of the State of Israel, and all of these Muslim countries now were kicking the Jews all out. So Israel would basically end Middle Eastern and North African Jewry. And again, if you're living in an African country that it's under the control of France, you can move to France and now become a citizen. So a lot of those Jews chose to move to France instead of Israel. So to give you the numbers, almost the population, the Jewish population of France almost doubled from 1951 to 1967. Actually, I think it over doubled. But there was about 250,000 Jews 1950, and there's going to be almost 250,000 Jews from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco who are going to move to France during these years. So all of a sudden, you're going to have a France that has a majority of Jews who are Sephardic. Although it's now Ashkenazic again, but this time these Jews coming from these areas do very well, and they kind of create the Jewish religious France that we know today, because a lot of the Ashkenazic Jews had by this time assimilated. So France to this day, of course, has a lot of Jews. It is, like I said, the third largest Jewish population. It's 500,000, maybe 600,000. At times has a good relationship with Israel. It had a great relationship with Israel after World War II. It was the #1 supplier of military weapons and military everything to Israel until the Six-Day War. And so, which is ironic because there's so many. So, right now, we hear about the anti-Semitism. There's a lot of debate as to how much it is, how widespread it is. A lot of French Jews have moved to Israel, but most have not. So anti-Semitism is a rise. It is, according to polls, it is very high in the French Muslim world, as high as over 80% are considered anti-Semitic at times. And it's getting higher in the outside world as well. There's been some violence, obviously, in the last few years, including the Paris attack, but there's too many to. But a lot of Jews in France are thinking of moving to Israel, but we will see. The issue with France today, obviously, is it is becoming more and more Muslim, and a lot of these Muslims have never assimilated and have bought into the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish rhetoric from their radical clerics and from their home countries. In the future, is it going to get better? Probably not. I mean, who knows? Hopefully. But the Muslim population in France is growing exponentially, and the non-Muslim population is shrinking exponentially, because the non-Muslim population has 1.5 kids per person, less than what we have in America, and whereas the Muslim population has a lot of kids. So I just went to a speaker on demographics, which was an incredible talk, and he said in 30 or 40 years it may probably be a Muslim country, predominantly Muslim country. So it is still a good place, though. I mean, there's anti-Semitism and all these, but a lot of Jews in France, very dedicated and love living there and want to stay and believe that it's only in certain corners of it. So I think most of the attacks are in the cities. So outside, there's been not as much anti-Semitism.
Rabbi,
Yes.
would you say it looks like the nature of anti-Semitism is now shifted dramatically toward because of the rise of the number of Arab or Muslim states or Arab states? You still hear a lot about nationalism in the countries, and you still hear a lot about Nazism, and the neo-Nazi groups and things like this.
And they're still there. Oh yeah, they're still there.
So it seems like it's a two-pronged attack now. Are we dealing with anti-Semitism predominantly? Is one larger than the other, would you say?
Well, I think percentage-wise, they say the Muslim is larger, but the Muslim population is not in power and doesn't have, so it's from all sides. You've got the neo-Nazis, you've got the central groups that have anti-Semitic statement but are so overt about it. And then you've got the Muslim population that is vehemently anti-Jewish as well in many respects.
Is there a neo-Nazi activist groups in
Oh yeah, in France, definitely. I mean, yeah, they are very. But the modern anti-Semitism is still anti-Israel. They will excuse everything they do by saying it's anti-Israel. Israel is persecuting, and so we have to kill Jews everywhere because of this, which of course is ridiculous, but that's what the anti-Semitism is today.
Would you say anything about the new elections that just took place in France?
I did not look up again what the effects are going to be, but we'll see because it's a
They
little.
had a radicalist that was running that was
That did not win, thank
yeah,
goodness.
did not win. This was a second time actually.
Yes. So I think
Marie something.
a lot of the countries are becoming more conservative, not like America, but more anti-Semitic conservative, not like America, and that's a fear. But it's not been. I think they were worried it was going to be worse. So I think we have to look to the future to see what's going to happen in places like France and especially Germany and England. Those three countries obviously will, determine the fate of Jews. We'll talk about next time. We were going to talk about some of the smaller countries like Amsterdam, which of course is a traditional big population. Of course, Denmark, which we famously know supported and saved all of their Jews during World War II. So we owe a lot of debt to Denmark, which I really want to go to. So we'll see. France could go either way. I mean, obviously the liberal won, but they don't have the kind of majority that they usually have. So it definitely was not a good election for Jews, but it was not as bad as it could have been, I think. But the next election could be worse. We'll see what the economy and what happens in, all around Europe. All right. Any thoughts? I was going to do Denmark and Amsterdam. I'm not thinking it would take this long for France, but I should have realized, France, we're going to do, next time we'll do Amsterdam, Belgium, and Denmark, those countries.
Just coincidentally, I was in the library and I picked up this book.
You can't see it.
I don't know if you can see it.
Points in Jewish history.
Yeah, and one of the chapters that I had skimmed through before was what's called the challenge of emancipation. Like, what do we do now that we're free?
Right, and that is
the France. And it's a problem that, I mean, you see all over the world. What do you do when slavery was the Emancipation Proclamation?
Right.
How do you react to that? What do you do with the United States pulling together 13 colonies when you're free? What do you do in Soviet Russia after the revolution? And sometimes those revolutions don't exactly solve things, but they go through it. This book talks about, maybe we could even read some chapters in it one time.
That'd be great. We could talk about turning points in Jewish history as well. That's a great subject.
Yeah, and he mentions this is, one of the predominant chapters, obviously, as well as the Crusades that you had mentioned before and things like this, as far as, if there are turning points that you could specific, history is very difficult to actually pinpoint dates and times.
For the turning points in France, would be 1000 when either 1007 when things start to, would be 1394, the expulsion. It would be the 17th century when Jews are allowed back, and especially would be, Napoleon. I mean, that was the seminal moment when Jews are basically given full rights over a period of years. But basically, the dominoes started before Napoleon, but Napoleon is the one who really put the stamp on it.
Yeah, but it's like the question he raises at the back of the book here at the end of each chapter.
What do you do with freedom? I mean,
what do you do with freedom? Yeah,
freedom is great. As we saw in the Middle East, they all had elections, and then no more elections after that. They haven't remember the Arab Spring. Everybody all having elections, and how many of those countries have had a second election? 0. Not one of them has a second election.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Stephen Sondheim Into the Woods, like with the fairy tale. And now what do you do after the giant is dead? What do you do after the ball is over? Act 2, how does that occur? And that's kind of like the most difficult situation is putting things together. And as we see even here in the United States now, and keeping them together.
Yeah.
The compromises that are reached. And
that's why You know, democracy is not about voting. It's about when the election, the term of office is over, and having another election and having somebody take the place. So America didn't become a democracy when George Washington was elected. We became a democracy when he stepped down and we voted somebody else in. And when Adams lost, we had a transition to Jefferson and there wasn't a war. That's democracy. It's not the election, it's the switching at some point. It's our country voting in 2 years, and when Biden wins or loses, Biden loses, he will step down and there will not be a civil war. That's democracy. All right, guys, a pleasure. So hopefully we'll have the gang back the next couple weeks. So we're going to do Belgium, Amsterdam, and Denmark next week. It's just interesting to write there. Obviously, the history of Amsterdam is much more well known and much more thoroughly researched because there was a very prominent community there, and Amsterdam became a world power. But obviously, Belgium next door, and especially Denmark, considering the amazing, beyond amazing moment in history where they stood up to the Nazis. And Denmark is never, not a, obviously in history it's been powerful, but in the 20th century it was not. And it stood up to the Nazis and showed what you could do, that the other countries probably could have done the same if they'd really tried. So stay safe, everyone, and we will see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Have fun storming the castle, everybody.